Now, I'm from Decatur, Georgia, and I was raised in the black church. When I turned 17, I started going to protest, and so call and response is a really big part of how I see and understand the world. So I'm going to have to ask you all to help me to kick off this TED Talk. If you'll repeat after me, I believe that we will win. Okay, y'all gonna have to say it again. I believe that we will win. Thank you. Now, I really do. I genuinely believe that human beings will overcome oppression, violence, and poverty. And not only do I think that this is possible, because I think we can live in a world with healthy and nutritious food for everyone, where everyone has a wonderful and safe place to live, where people are surrounded by families and communities that welcome and accept them, where race and gender and sexual equality are the norm. And it's actually violence is such a rare occurrence that is something that we all as a community have to get together and think proactively about how to prevent. And not only do I think this is possible, but it's doable. Now, to be honest with you, I didn't always believe this. And I want to talk to you a little bit about my roots and begin to paint the picture for you to help you understand why I didn't believe that we would win and now why I do. So my story starts in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know exactly where, because it starts, my recollection of that story starts with the transatlantic slave trade. But it's so important to me to start my roots in sub-Saharan Africa because it highlights the importance of identity. My great-grandmother, May Liza Thomas, worked on a cotton plantation. She picked hundreds of pounds of cotton every day. She churned, fresh milk into butter for her children. And she created a life for her children in the segregated Mississippi South, in the heart of Jim Crow, in the heart of what many consider to be one of the most racist states in the U.S. My grandmother, at 16 years old, with a baby on her hip and $17 in her pocket, decided to move from Mississippi to Central Florida because she thought she'd be able to get a better job and get farther away from that plantation. She worked as a laundress for over 40 years in segregated nursing homes where she wouldn't be able to live. But my mother was born in the semi-rural slum of Apopka, Florida, where she experienced drug raids from DEA every weekend and also played piano with her grandmother every Sunday in church. And it's important for you to know these origins that start before I was even born, because you need to know that sub-Saharan Africa and the Mississippi plantation and the DEA raids of Apopka, Florida are a part of who I am and how I see the world before I ever entered it. Then we enter me. I was born at Florida A&M University and HBCU while my parents were students there. And I grew up surrounded by African-American people who were studying, who were reading, who were exceptional, who were professors, who were going to be doctors and lawyers. And so I had no sort of questions in my mind from the age of 1 to 3 years old that I could do anything I set my mind to. And then my parents got married and moved up to Atlanta, Georgia, which many refer to as the Black Mecca, because African-American middle-class families have built their own suburbs, and Atlanta was one of the first cities in the United States to have a black mayor. Growing up in Atlanta, again, my dentist looked like me, the mayor looked like me, the judge looked like me, everyone looked like me, and so I had no kind of questions about who I could be in this world. And growing up in Atlanta, though, I saw in that place where everyone looked like me, that poverty looked like me, that stress looked like me, that hunger looked like me. And so I left from Decatur, that Black Mecca, to go into academia because I had so many questions about the world, about poverty, about oppression and violence, and where it came from, and where ultimately was the humanity of my great-grandmother, May Liza, on that Mississippi cotton plantation, and where was the humanity of my grandmother, Margaret Flowers, in that segregated nursing home, and where was the humanity of my mother when she was 19 years old and cast aside because she got pregnant out of wedlock with me. And so this is what's pushed me into the third sector and ultimately into the private sector to try and continue to find the answers to those questions. And so in my undergraduate degree, I had one question that I had to answer. Do black prosecutors matter? Now, this is in the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. This was in 2017. And everyone was talking about criminal justice reform, mass incarceration, racism, and saying that the solution was more representation. So I had a very specific question. Do black prosecutors matter? And the answer that I found was kinda, but not really. Because if you look at these numbers behind me, you'll see that the disparities did decrease when the prosecutor or the person who decided who gets charged with a crime and for how long they should be charged. When this person looks like that community, those disparities do drop, but they're not eliminated, and they still stand at nearly 5 times. So I get to this realization that you can change the pilot all you want, but if the plane's on autopilot, it doesn't really matter. So at this point, I'm like enraged, I'm pissed off, I'm confused, I don't understand because I've gone to school, I've seen all these lived experiences, and everyone told me representation was the answer. And so I did this research to just confirm that, and the research said, no, girl, it's not. And this is all in the light of 2014, 2 weeks before I was due to move into Emory, watching Mike Brown's body lay in the street of Ferguson, Missouri. And just 1 year later, when I got involved with Atlanta Black Students United and became an activist and organizer in Atlanta, Anthony Hill was murdered by DeKalb County Police while he was having a schizophrenic episode. And then, because I was a nerd, I remembered that in my African American studies classes, I learned about Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was killed by a police officer in 1965, which sparked the March on Selma. And so I went home for the weekend to have a conversation with my parents because I told you I'm from Decatur, Georgia. I'm a mama's girl. So I went home and I was sitting on the couch and I had my head in my hands. And I remember my dad came into the room and he said, Chelsea, what happened to the twinkle in your eyes? And I said, Dad, the world. Racism, white supremacy, oppression, poverty, violence, sexism, all the isms, they have sucked that light, that twinkle right out of me. I'm fighting against racism, I'm fighting against sexism, I'm fighting against exclusion. And my dad asked me a very simple question. Well, what are you fighting for? I said, well, Dad, isn't it the same thing? I just told you I'm against racism. That means I'm for racial equality. He said, no, it doesn't. I said, I just told you misogyny is horrible. That means I think women are equal. He said, that doesn't mean that. And my dad told me, when he asked me what I was fighting for, I realized I didn't have an answer. I only had an answer to the things I was fighting against. And so I went on this mission to find something to fight for because I felt so disappointed, so disillusioned, and so disempowered that I couldn't see another way forward. So when I realized that I needed something to fight for, I started, again, I told you I'm a nerd, so research. I said, well, let's look at poverty in Atlanta and let's find out if our housing policy actually, reduces poverty. Well, let's look at black women's oppression and let's look at their experiences on these plantations because I really want to understand what my great-grandmother went through. Or maybe let's jump over and think about representation, or maybe let's think about housing, or maybe let's think about. And as I go through and I'm still looking for something to fight for, I'm looking in political science, public policy, sociology, education. I mean, if there are any more disciplines, anthropology, sociology. But when I get down to the bottom of this academic work, I wrote a paper called Abolition and Racial Democracy in my first year at Oxford. And that was the first time that I felt I had written something that I could fight for. And then I got invited to join this incredible collective called the Cradle Community. And we wrote this incredible book that I will ask you to read called Brick by Brick, How We Build a World Without Prisons. So what did I learn in this mission of asking all these questions, of using my life experience to try and find the answers to the solutions to build the world that I wanted? I realized that ultimately I was fighting for people over systems. I was fighting for people over ideals. I was fighting for people over ideology, because if the rule of law as an idea is more important than this human being, we have the criminal justice system that we have. If the current economic system we have is more important than every child having healthy and nutritious food, then we have global poverty. And if an ideology, whether it be liberalism, whether it be socialism, no matter what ideology it is, if this ideology and you subscribing to this ideology is more important than people, that's why we live in the world that we live in. So ultimately, it's not about terms or ideologies or academic disciplines. It's just about people over systems, people over ideals, people over ideology. And that's when I arrived on this little concept that I like to call the justice bubble. Because I realized that every single human person has one of these inside of you. And if we all push them outside of us and put them together, we could encompass the whole world in one, a justice bubble. And we could actually make that world that I was talking about at the beginning. And so I want to talk to you about your power, because you can change the world. You can change the world. You can change the world. And so can you. One room at a time. So how do you do that? You have to see, accept, and act on the humanity of every person in every space that you enter. What does that look like? When you go into the local Sainsbury's local and you see the tellers and you say, hello. You see them. So then when you accept their humanity and accept they're not any less than you because they're not in uni. Or maybe they are in uni and they just need a little bit of extra money to support them. But once you see them and you accept them as they are, and then you act on their humanity, when something comes up and we talk about how much the minimum wage is in this country, you'll support it because you've seen, accepted, and acted on the humanity of that teller in Sainsbury's. It won't be that you yourself know that you'll never earn the minimum wage, but you're seeing, accepting, and acting on that person's humanity. You have the power to change outcomes. So let's start right here at St. Andrews University. If you're writing a research project where you're going to go out into the community to interview people, you have the power to shape how they see academics, how they see this university, how they see research, heck, even your discipline. You have the power to shape that. And when you do, maybe you decide that you want to pay everyone who participates in your surveys, or you want to give them a final say in the final editing of their quotes so that they don't feel exploited, but that they feel as a collaborative partner. And then maybe you go to your department's ethics board or the head of your department research and say, hey, these are some guidelines I'd like to recommend for our department. Now you've changed your research paper. You changed the outcomes for those people who you've worked with, and now you've changed an institution, your department. So every researcher who comes behind you is now going to have to think about the humanity of the people they engage with. And imagine if you change the future. And so you get that one department to speak to another department, speak to another department, and now the entire University of St. Andrews interacts with St. Andrews and Edinburgh and the local communities in a much different way, a less exploitative way. That's something that you could start right now, today. You have the power. So how do you bring this justice bubble that's inside of you? How do you bring it out? The first one, and Allie stole my talking point. Impact over intent. Because I didn't intend to hurt you, doesn't change that you were hurt. And until we accept that the impact is always more important than the intention, we will never create the world that we want to live in. So ultimately, how do you bring that justice bubble from inside of you out? You first look at the impact before you consider intentions. Who was harmed? Is everyone okay? Do you have everything you need? What was the impact? Not, we intended for this policy to help the poor. Let's look at the impacts. Not, we intended for this policy to bring more women into the office, but we actually see the equity gap growing. Again, you've got to look at the impact. So it's not just interpersonal, it's also systemic. And in the areas that you make decisions, look at the impact, not just the intent. Don't be fooled by the objectives. Read deep into the policy and ask, what's the impact of this going to be? Not just the intention or the veneer. The second one is that you're going to have to add activist. So one of my personal beliefs is that activist is not a title. It's not a job title. It's not a career. I wasn't a little girl thinking, I want to be an activist when I grow up. I actually believe that no human being should be an activist, because we shouldn't have social problems on such a scale that those of us are dedicating all our time and energy to eliminating them, because that's what activists do. So, because I believe that no one should be an activist, that means we all need to be activist blank. So I'm an activist political scientist. What kind of activist are you? What kind of activist are you? What kind of activist are you? You can be an activist in anything that you do. And so if you add activist, if you take a stand to systemically and continually reduce the social problems in our world, you can reduce the need for people like me to be introduced as activists. And finally, tree solidarity. I want to tell you something amazing about trees, which is that they practice a Western philosophical concept known as Ubuntu. Ubuntu talks about I am because we are. It's the idea that we're all interconnected, and so anything that happens to you happens to me. Many people may be familiar with the poem, first they came for the Jews, then they came for the Catholics, and when they came for me, there was no one to stand for me. And so the reason I bring this back to trees is that trees practice Ubuntu. Something that's so amazing is when you leave here today, I want you to go out and look at a group of trees. And you'll notice that they're all very similar in size, in height. I found out something amazing, which is that a tree could have been growing for 3 years and 2 new saplings sprout up in the soil next to it. That tree will stunt its own growth, take less nitrogen from the soil, and absorb less water through its roots to allow those saplings to grow. And after 2 years, when the saplings have caught up, all 3 trees will again share and begin to interchange that. And this is not just happening of trees of the same species, might I add. Trees of different species are also communicating with one another through mycelial networks, or the little veins that connect mushrooms to one another. And so one group of cherry blossom trees is communicating to another set of trees, and they're saying, hey, we've got a lot of excess nitrogen, they need some, let's drop it into the soil, the mycelial will move it around, and they'll be able to suck that up. Oh, I'm a big oak tree, I have so many roots, I could absorb all of the water and let you all drown, but I won't do that. I'll reduce my water intake to let you all have water. So why am I telling you this really weird, nerdy thing about trees? Because trees practice Ubuntu, trees practice solidarity, trees, and they don't just do it within their own species. They don't just say, oh, you're a cherry blossom tree, so I got you. No. It's across the forest. And so what does this mean? If we listen to nature, if we showed solidarity to other human beings, just like trees, I mean, we could create a world that would be amazing, fantastic. We would be able to change everything. And so, no, I didn't always believe, but now I do believe, and I hope you do too. Thank you.